Python programming language has over 60 built-in functions to help you code more efficiently. In this video, we will discuss the function float. Hello, Python learners. In today's video, we're exploring the float function, a built-in tool for working with floating point numbers in Python. By the end of this video, you'll understand how it works, when to use it, and how to apply it in your projects. Let's jump in. What is the float function? The float function converts a value into a floating point number. Here's the syntax: float and argument x, where x is the value you want to convert to a floating point number. X can be a string, an integer, or another number type. If the input is invalid, Python will raise a value error. So why use float? It's essential for converting data into floating point format for mathematical calculations or when working with decimal numbers. Here are a few key concepts. First, floating point numbers are numbers with a decimal point, like 3.14 or 0.5. The float function is great for converting strings, integers, or scientific notations into float values. If you pass no argument into the float function, it will return the value 0.0. Now, you'd use float when you're converting user input, which is often string format, into a number for calculations, or when working with numeric data that requires precise representation of fractions or decimals. Float can help you with your significant digits. You could also use it for handling data from files or external sources that store numbers as strings. Let's start with a simple example that converts an integer to a float. In this example, float 10 converts the integer 10 into the floating point number 10.0. In our second example, we'll convert a string to a float. Note that float is able to convert strings that contain numeric values. In this example, we have the value 3.14 stored as a string. By applying the built-in function float to 3.14 string, it converts the string into the floating point number 3.14. In our third example, we use float to interpret numbers in scientific notation, which is useful for working with large or small values. You can see the value 1e to the negative third, which represents 1 times 10 raised to the negative third power. Using float, it converts the scientific notation 1e minus 3 into the floating point value 0.001. In our fourth example, we show you what happens if you do not include an argument in the float function. Note that it will return a 0.0. In example 5, we're going to see what happens if you pass an invalid argument into the float function. If you do this, Python will raise a value error. Note you should always validate user input to ensure it's a valid number before converting it with float. Here are some important things to keep in mind about the float function. Floating point numbers are represented in binary, which can lead to precision issues with some decimal numbers. If the input value is already a float, the float function will return it unchanged. And for safer handling of invalid input, consider wrapping float calls in a try except block. And that's the float function. To recap, it converts values into floating point numbers. It works with integers, strings, and scientific notations. And you should handle invalid input carefully to avoid errors. Thanks for watching. If you found this video helpful, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more Python tips. Happy coding!